I do want to, as you had in the bulletin, wish you a happy Valentine's Day. But you know, we have many other dates that coming up between now and our May meeting. So happy Valentine's, President's Day, Pulaski Day, St. Patrick's, St. Joseph's, and Easter. And if I missed any, sorry. If there's no further business to come before this meeting.
There's just, we might want to mention there's free directories and free newsletters on the back table.
Okay, great. We will adjourn for the meeting portion. I know that June probably had a really nice little write-up to introduce Mrs. Lincoln, but I didn't know until shortly before I came today that she's ill, and so I'm just going to read generally from the bulletin it received. The program that today will explore the tragic experience of Mary Lincoln's widowhood, including her trial for insanity. It is written and performed by Donna Daniels of Wheaton. Donna and her husband Max have been portraying the Lincoln since 1988. They presented one of their programs a few years ago, The President and Mrs. Lincoln, for the Society, and I think that was about 10 years ago. At this time, Mrs. Lincoln, would you please do the program?
Thank you. The children say a crazy woman lives here. I can hear them sometimes throwing stones against the window. Don't they know who I am? Don't they think I've suffered enough? I was Mrs. President Lincoln. Of course, when I first met him, no one really thought he would amount to very much. Least of all my eldest sister, Elizabeth. Dear Elizabeth, ever since we were children, she seemed more like a mother to me than a sister. I was born on December 13th, 1818, in Lexington, Kentucky, the fourth child of Robert Smith Todd and Eliza Parker. My father was a successful banker, businessman, and politician, and the Todd family could trace the distinguished military service of our ancestors all the way back to the American Revolution. We lived in a mansion and even owned slaves, although we treated them very well. As the child of such a wealthy and illustrious family, my life should have been quite happy. But when I was 6 years old, my mother died, giving birth to her seventh child, my brother George. I, of course, was too young to understand death. I only knew that my mother had suddenly abandoned me. Less than a year and a half later, my father remarried and started another family with his new wife. I immediately resented my stepmother and soon made it a point to spend as much time as possible away from home. My grandmother Parker, who lived nearby, was sympathetic to my plight and allowed me to stay at her home quite often. I also began attending boarding schools in Lexington. Now, my father was a very unusual man for his time in that he encouraged all of his children, male and female, to receive an education. Generally, it was considered unnecessary for girls to receive much education, but my father believed that educated women attracted better husbands. And so I was sent to finishing school, first to the Shelby Female Academy, then to Madame Mentel's. I studied reading, writing, arithmetic, grammar, history, geography, and French, as well as dancing, needlework, and all the finer points of etiquette. I soon came to regard Mentel's as my true home, for my childhood years in my stepmother's house were indeed desolate. Now, Elizabeth, in the meantime, had married and moved to Springfield, Illinois, with her husband, Mr. Ninian W. Edwards. When she extended an invitation for me to visit her there in 1837, I welcomed the opportunity. Although I returned to Lexington after that visit, in the spring of 1839, I made plans to return to Springfield to live permanently. I had many friends in Springfield, and I was a member of what was called the Coterie, a group of young men and women who would get together to discuss politics, recite poetry, and catch up on all the local gossip. But it was at a cotillion in December of that year that I was to meet a tall, gangling lawyer by the name of Abraham Lincoln. A cotillion is a dance, you know, and he came over to me, extended his hand, and said, "Miss Todd, tell Elizabeth later on that he certainly did dance in the worst way. Oh, of course, my family did not approve of him. My sister Frances thought he was the homeliest man in Springfield. Elizabeth and Ninian objected mainly to his poverty, feeling that a man with his lack of background and social standing was not quite good enough for the daughter of Robert Smith Todd of Kentucky. But I found him to be of the most congenial mind I'd ever encountered. We shared a love of Shakespeare, poetry, children, and politics. You see, my father had also allowed me to sit in and listen when political conversations were going on in our home, and some of the most prominent political figures of the day were frequent visitors in our home. Henry Clay was a particular hero of mine, and so I was quite pleased to learn that he was also Mr. Lincoln's beau ideal. We were able to talk for hours on end about so many things, and I even enjoyed listening to his stories. Now, I had many suitors, of course, for, although you may not believe it now, I was considered quite a catch in my day. But I had already turned down more than one marriage proposal because I had always vowed that my hand would never be given where my heart was not. I wanted a man with a head for position, fame, and power, a man of mind with hope and bright prospects. And I somehow always knew that the man I married would someday become the President of the United States. Well, I married Mr. Lincoln on November the 4th of 1842, right here in Elizabeth's house, even though she still objected. We lived in Springfield for 17 years. All of our children were born here. My angel boys, all but one now taken from me. Our eldest, Robert, was born in August of 1843. Then Edward in March of 1846, William in December of 1850, and our youngest, Thomas, in April of 1853. Eddie was the first to die of consumption, February of 1850. He was only 4 years old. Without Mr. Lincoln at my side to comfort and sustain me, I know I could never have borne the loss of my child. But it was after Eddie's death that Willie and Taddy were born, and we somehow pulled our lives together and went on. Mr. Lincoln's legal practice continued to grow, and eventually his political career began to blossom as well. I must say with some pride that I was of enormous assistance to him during this time. It was I, you know, who polished his manners and made sure he dressed properly, made sure his trousers were long enough and both socks matched. I was also able to give him the benefit of my insight when it came to dealing with people. And now Mr. Lincoln was always very astute politically, of course, but he naturally lacked my feminine intuition when it came to judging people's personalities or their motives. I frequently tried to counsel him in regard to appointments I felt he should make or people who were not to be trusted, and I believe that he came to regard me as a trusted political advisor. He was so disappointed when Stephen Douglas defeated him for the Senate in 1858. But 2 years later, my girlhood prediction came true when Mr. Lincoln was elected President of the United States. I was so proud of him. But that was a difficult time in our country. And before long, the issues of slavery and states' rights had torn this nation apart in that terrible Civil War. Mr. Lincoln always believed that his primary duty was to preserve the Union at all costs. But please believe me when I tell you that it grieved him deeply to witness so much suffering and death. It was a time of suffering for myself as well. As the country began to choose sides, north and south, my family in Kentucky, like many others in the country at that time, also began to divide. Almost all of my half-brothers chose to join the Confederate Army. Of my 2 full brothers, the eldest, Levi, tried to join the Union Army, but he was too old. The youngest, George, became a surgeon for the Confederacy. My favorite half-sister, Emily, had married a dashing young officer by the name of Benjamin Hardin Helm. And when the war broke out, Mr. Lincoln offered him a commission in the Union Army. But he turned it down and went south. He was killed at the Battle of Chattanooga. Emily came to stay with us at the White House for a short time after that, but she refused to take the oath of allegiance to the Union. And when Mr. Lincoln refused to grant her special privileges unless she took the oath, why, she accused him of causing her husband's death, went back to Kentucky in a snit, and I have never spoken to my favorite half-sister again. Almost all of my brothers died for the Confederate cause. And because of this, I myself was accused of being a Southern sympathizer, a Confederate spy, a traitor in the White House. Now I ask you, why should I be held responsible for a choice my brothers made? That was their choice, not mine. My first loyalty was always to my husband and to the government he represented. It is but natural, of course, to suppose that I would grieve for someone so related to myself, but not to the extent that was supposed. If my brothers chose to fight against us and sought to destroy our government, then I saw no reason to bitterly mourn their deaths. How could I grieve for traitors? There were other deaths I grieved much more. In February of 1862, our darling Willie was taken from us. He had lingered for 2 weeks with what was called bilious fever, and everything that human skill could do was done for our sainted boy. But I have come to believe that God sees fit to punish us in our moments of triumph. We had just given a wonderful party that was called the most superb affair of its kind ever seen. And yet while our guests were celebrating downstairs, our son lay dying upstairs. Mr. Lincoln and I frequently left the party to be at his bedside, but I have never been able to forgive myself or to escape the terrible feeling of guilt that Willie's death was somehow caused by our success. He was buried 4 days later during a terrible storm. I was not able to attend the funeral, so prostrate was I with my grief. It was 3 weeks before I could even get out of bed and get dressed. In fact, Mr. Lincoln became so concerned about my mental state that one day he took me to the window and showed me the lunatic asylum across the way. And he said, "Mother, if you do not get control of your grief, it will drive you mad, and we may have to send you there." But he never did. If I had not felt the spur of necessity urging me to cheer Mr. Lincoln, whose grief I know was as great as my own, I do not believe that I could ever have smiled again. Eventually, I was able to take some comfort in the idea that only a very slight veil separates us from our loved and lost, and though unseen by us, they are very near. I'm somewhat embarrassed now to admit that for a time I put great faith in spiritualists and mediums, believing that they could help me to communicate with the children that God had so cruelly taken away from me. Perhaps it was true, as Mr. Lincoln said, that they were merely duping me, but, well, as I say, I took a measure of comfort in it then. There's only one other way in which I've always been able to comfort myself in times of sorrow and tragedy. I buy things. Now, much has been made of my spending habits. In fact, they were even used against me as evidence of my instability. But I always had very good reasons. Well, for instance, when we first moved to the White House, its condition can only be described as deplorable. The furnishings were shabby and worn. Some of the furniture was even broken. None of the china matched. I felt this was absolutely unsuitable for the home of the President of the United States. The chief executive of a nation must have a home that is elegant and well furnished in order to reflect the power and authority of his government, to reassure his own people that all is well. In the same way, the President and his family must be well dressed and keep up with current fashion. Now, I received great assistance in this regard from a woman named Elizabeth Keckley, a mulatto seamstress who had been recommended to me shortly after we arrived in Washington. I was very impressed with her work, and she became not only my modiste, but my friend and confidant for many years. Now, when selecting fabrics and furnishings, I usually preferred to make my purchases in New York and Philadelphia, where the best stores were. And at first, the merchants there were happy to offer me discounts and bargains and credit. I soon learned, however, that they almost always expected something from me in return, to influence my husband on their behalf, perhaps. Well, naturally, I was flattered that they recognized the power of my position, and I quickly learned how to play that little game of patronage. Now, sometimes I was under the impression that a particular item had been given as a gift. Imagine my surprise when I received a bill for it. Now, some of them I did do favors for, and some of them I returned. Some I renegotiated, but most of the time I just tried to get the bills paid. By the government, of course. Now, I received great assistance in this regard from Commissioner Benjamin French, who showed me a way in which unused monies in other budgets could be reappropriated for use at the White House. Well, don't you see, I had to get those bills paid. If I didn't, they would have told Mr. Lincoln about them. We had already argued once before when I had overspent the $20,000 Congress had allowed me to redecorate the White House. He had even threatened to pay the difference out of his own pocket, but I told him he mustn't do that. In the first place, we couldn't afford it. And in the second place, I have always believed it is the responsibility of the government to provide for the president and his family. I was in an agony of anxiety, particularly fearful during the re-election campaign of 1864. You see, the war had not been going very well for the Union, and Mr. Lincoln did not expect to be renominated, let alone re-elected. But I prayed that he would be re-elected, for as long as he were the president, my creditors would continue to treat me with the courtesy and respect due to the president's wife. But if he were not re-elected, there would no longer be any deterrent to prevent them from presenting all bills for immediate payment, and he would know all. As I say, I was in an agony of anxiety until the election was over, and then I was assured that Mr. Lincoln had indeed been elected to a second term. Then, shortly after his second inaugural, we received even more wonderful news. The rebels had surrendered. The war at last was over. Mr. Lincoln immediately began making plans for reconstruction. He intended generosity, mercy, forgiveness. He wanted no more of that bloody work. He seemed so relaxed and peaceful that last day. We went for a carriage ride in the afternoon. We held hands again, as we had not done for some time. And he said to me, "Mother, we must both be more cheerful. Between the war and the loss of our darling Willie, we have been very miserable." That evening, we were scheduled to attend the final performance of Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater. Both of us were feeling a little tired, actually. And we had almost decided not to go. But it had been advertised that we would be there. The public would be expecting to see us. We didn't want to disappoint the public. General and Mrs. Grant had been invited to accompany us, but they preferred to visit their children in New Jersey. Robert was too tired. None of the cabinet members were available, so in the end, it was Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris, who joined us that night in the presidential box. Shortly after the third act started, a little after 10 o'clock at night, Mr. Lincoln leaned over to me, reached over, took my hand in his. I leaned over to him and I said, "Mr. Lincoln, what will Miss Harris think of my hanging on to you so?" And he replied, "She won't think anything of it." Oh, someone help me, please help me. Help me, please help me. Where are you taking him? No, you are across the street. You mustn't move him. Mr. Lincoln, please speak to me. You mustn't leave me. Tad, bring Tad me that a funeral was held in the East Room, and that Mr. Lincoln's body was returned to Springfield for burial. Darling Willie's casket was also sent home with his father, but I was not able to attend the funeral nor accompany them on the train. So overcome was I by my grief. Several friends attempted to comfort me, but how could I be consoled when my life, my all, my sainted husband had been so cruelly taken from my side? I have often felt that it might have been some solace to me and lessened the grief that breaks my heart if he had passed away after an illness, and I had been permitted to watch over him and tend him to the last. I might have received his loving farewell in return. I could have thanked him for his lifelong devotion to me and asked his forgiveness for any inadvertent moment of pain I might have caused him. It was toward the end of May, nearly 6 weeks later, before I was able to rouse myself to pack my things and leave the White House. And in all that time, that villain, Andrew Johnson, never once called on me or sent a sympathy note, only an inquiry as to how soon I would be vacating the premises so that he could move in. I tell you, I felt then and still feel quite certain that Andrew Johnson was in some way a conspirator in the assassination. For did he not ascend at my husband's death? They were all suspects to my mind. Seward, Stanton, all of them had plotted and schemed against my husband from the very beginning. I alone had defended and supported him totally and completely. It soon became clear that I should have to defend him in death as well. Shortly after the assassination, the Lincoln Monument Association in Springfield, without consulting me, purchased a plot of land in Springfield where they planned to lay my husband's remains and erect a grand monument which would be visible from anywhere in town. But Mr. Lincoln had made his wishes known quite clearly to me not long before he died. We were on our way back from City Point, Virginia, and had stopped for a moment in a particularly green and peaceful spot. He said to me, "Mary, when I am gone, lay my remains in some quiet place like this." My choice for him was Oak Ridge Cemetery on the outskirts of Springfield, and this location would also ensure that a place could be reserved for myself and our sons to be buried there with him. I received much opposition to my request. To Richard J. Oglesby, June 5th, 1865. Dear Sir, I learned from the newspapers and other sources that your association have it in contemplation to erect a monument to my husband's memory on the Mather block in the city of Springfield, instead of over his remains in Oak Ridge Cemetery. I feel it is due to candor and fairness that I should notify your Monument Association that unless I receive within the next 10 days an official assurance that the monument will be erected over the tomb in Oak Ridge Cemetery, in accordance with my oft-expressed wishes, I shall yield my consent to the request of the National Monument Association in Washington, and have the sacred remains deposited there, in the vault prepared for Washington, under the dome of the national Capitol. I remain your deeply afflicted friend, Mary Lincoln. To Mr. Richard J. Oglesby, June 10th, 1865. Dear Sir, I perceive by the paper today that, notwithstanding the note I recently addressed to you, yourself and Mr. Hatch are en route to Chicago to consult with me on the subject. My determination is unalterable, and I shall rigidly comply with my resolution. If I had anticipated so much trouble in having my wishes carried out, I should have readily yielded to the requests of the many, and had his precious remains in the first instance placed in the vault of the National Capitol. It is very painful to me to be treated in this manner by some of those I consider to be my friends. Very respectfully, Mrs. Lincoln. Well, at last the association yielded to the prerogative of a widow to select her husband's final resting place. But I could not bring myself to return to Springfield. Robert and Judge David Davis, who was the executor of the estate, saw no reason for me not to move back into our house at the corner of 8th and Jackson. But that house, the entire city of Springfield, held too many memories for me. To be placed there, deprived of the presence of my husband and our children, would have been too painful to bear. So, Robert, Tabby, and I came to Chicago, close enough to visit Mr. Lincoln's grave, and yet far enough away so as not to be daily assaulted by scenes that would remind me of happier times. We lived in hotels and boarding houses in Chicago for about 3 years. It was all we could afford. I rarely went out, and although several friends attempted to visit me, I felt unable to receive many callers. My overwhelming grief had had a very injurious effect upon my health, of course, but I was also trying to avoid the pitying looks and the evidence that others were still going on about their lives while mine was all but over. My main contact with the outside world became my letters. To Sally Orne, August 31st, 1865. My dear Mrs. Orne, bowed down and heartbroken in my terrible bereavement, my thoughts this last sad summer have often turned to you. Time does not reconcile me to the loss of the most devoted and loving husband a sadly afflicted woman ever possessed. How dearly I long to lay my aching head and sorrowing heart by the side of my dearly loved one. When the summons comes for my departure, I will gladly welcome it, for there the weary are at rest. As you may well suppose, I have led a life of most rigid seclusion since I left Washington. We are very differently situated from what we would desire or from what should be expected from our former station. We are deprived of the comfort of a home where my poor, sadly afflicted sons and myself could quietly indulge our griefs. We are left with only $1,500 a year each to live upon, the interest on our money, and as a matter of course must board plainly and as genteel as possible on this sum. I mention this by way of excusing a subject I will mention to you. A friend of my husband's and myself presented me last February with a very elegant lace dress, very fine and beautiful, a double lace shawl, very fine, exactly similar pattern, with the request that I wear it on the night of the inauguration. For 2 hours that evening I did so. Next morning, most carefully, it was folded tenderly away. My desire is to dispose of these articles. It cost in New York $3,500. Of course, if I can get $2,500 for them, it will be a great consideration to me. If you know of anyone who would desire such a dress, will you not gratify me, dear friend, by informing me? You may well be assured that only dire necessity, which I have never before known anything about, would cause me to write so freely to you. I am so anxious to have my boys in a quiet home of our own, and without I make some exertions of the kind, such as disposing of my now unnecessary articles, I fear I cannot succeed. If any of your friends would desire such articles, please, please advise me. Your attached friend, Mary Lincoln. Judge Davis was very slow in processing my husband's estate. Mr. Lincoln had died without leaving a will, which meant that the estate would eventually be divided 3 ways among Robert, Tad, and myself. But in the meantime, I needed money. I desired to buy a house, of course, but I also had outstanding debts that needed to be paid. Judge Davis didn't know anything about them, and so, of course, could not appreciate my feeling of urgency. I had to do something. Now, subscription drives were a common and very respectable way of raising money for orphans and widows and orphan children, and so I attempted to get several of these started. Through an agent, Alexander Williamson, I approached wealthy and influential Republicans and appealed to them to contribute to a fund in my behalf. I felt this was the least they could do, since most of them owed their political offices, and thus much of their wealth, to my martyred husband. I suggested that by assisting his widow and children, they could express their gratitude and appreciation to him. Well, I soon learned the depth of their ingratitude. Now that there was nothing to be gained by them for helping me, I could die in the street for all they cared. I then began to lobby Congress for a pension and the remainder of Mr. Lincoln's salary for the 4-year term to which he had been elected. Although he had served only 6 weeks before he was murdered, I felt I was entitled to the full $100,000 since my husband had given up his life in the service of his country. They voted me a paltry 1 year's salary, $25,000, from which they deducted 6 weeks' pay and federal tax, leaving me with only a little over $22,000. It was a pitiful offering at best, and most ungraciously bestowed. I was able to use the funds to buy a little house in Chicago, but without additional funds to maintain it, I was ultimately forced to rent it out. Then it occurred to me, I could sell my wardrobe. You see, ever since Mr. Lincoln died, I have worn nothing but widow's weeds. I had no further use for the elegant and rich dresses I had worn in the White House. Other widows and even some European royalty had raised money by selling their clothing without any aspersions being cast on the propriety of it. So in September of 1867, Lizzie Keckley and I set forth for New York in search of a commission agent. I decided upon Mr. William Brady and his partner, Mr. Samuel Keyes. Through them, I launched another letter-writing campaign, urging prominent public figures to remember the many favors that my husband and I had done for them in the past, and suggesting that they should be only too happy to relieve my poverty by purchasing one or more of my items. But no one bought anything. Mr. Brady and Mr. Keyes then suggested that we might generate more interest by a public showing of the clothes. I agreed, but oh, how I wish now that I had not. It turned into a humiliating public spectacle with curiosity seekers far outnumbering any potential buyers. They came to look for the dress that I had worn to Ford's Theater that night, to see if his bloodstains were still on it. They came to see if any of my things were soiled or torn, or how much I had originally paid for them. The newspapers began calling it Mrs. Lincoln's second-hand clothing sale and the old clothes scandal. And pretty soon the Republicans and the Democrats were turning it into a political scandal as well, but for their own purposes, not for my benefit. To Judge David Davis, November of 1867. The papers are abounding with notices of settlement of the estate and the amount left to each of us. As I have not heard a word from Robert on the subject, I consider it necessary that I should be quite as well informed as the press regarding my own business. The estate totaled $110,000 and was divided 3 ways among Robert, Tad, and myself, with each of us receiving a share of approximately $36,000. With this, I determined to put the Atlantic Ocean between myself and this ungrateful republic, and soon after Robert's marriage in 1868, Tad and I set sail for Europe. We stayed in Germany for about 2 years, then traveled on to France and Italy, England, Scotland. I intended for Tad to receive a good European education, for myself to visit the spas and the water cures for my physical ailments, to seeking relief from the neuralgia that had begun to cause my head and limbs to ache constantly. I continued the campaign for my pension, aided by several good and loyal friends, and finally in July of 1870, I was at last rewarded when Congress voted me an annual pension of $3,000. Actually, I had been hoping for more, but the amount that was voted to me was of great assistance, and I feel certain that if a larger amount had been insisted upon, it would have fallen through altogether. By May of 1871, Taddy was quite homesick. so we returned to America to visit Robert and his wife in Chicago. But within a month, Tad had come down with what I thought was only a bad cold. The doctors kept reassuring me that he would get better. But he didn't. He died on July 15th, at the age of 18. Undoubtedly God's punishment for the success of my pension campaign. Now I was utterly alone. In the past, his father would have comforted me, but now all I had left in the world was Robert, and Robert was too bowed down with his own grief to be of much comfort to me. I was still living in Robert's home in Chicago when the Great Fire broke out in October of '71. It seemed to be a vision of hell itself, and left me so frightened of fires that thereafter I've traveled with a step stool in each one of my trunks so that I may climb to the window and escape the next time the building catches fire. Homeless once more, I became as a nomad, traveling to Wisconsin and Canada for the water cures for my physical ailments, to New York to consult with the mediums and spiritualists again in an attempt to communicate with my loved and lost. In 1875, I had traveled to Florida for the warm weather, but while there I became convinced that something was wrong with Robert, my only surviving son, that he was ill, perhaps even dying. I hurried to the telegraph office. Sir, please send this to Chicago for me at once. My dearly beloved son, Robert T. Lincoln, rouse yourself and live for my sake. All I have is yours from this moment. I am praying every moment for your life to be spared to your mother. And then I took the next train back to Chicago. Well, to my amazement, Robert met me at the Chicago train station quite well and healthy. Of course, I was much relieved at this, but then I told him of my other anxieties. You see, I'd had the feeling for some time that I was being followed, and in fact, someone had tried to poison me on the train, but I purposely drank an overdose, which caused me to vomit it up. Someone had stolen my reticule, too, but I expected that to be returned soon. Besides, they could not steal my money because I had converted it into bonds and sewn them into my petticoats. Then on May 19th, 1875, I had been shopping earlier in the day and was expecting a delivery person with the merchandise. When I heard a knock at the door, why, Mr. Leonard Sweat, what a pleasant surprise. Why, of course I remember such an old and good friend of my husband's. Come in, come in. What can I do for you? I must go with you to the courthouse? To be tried for insanity? Do you mean to say that I am crazy? Well, I'm much obliged to you, sir, but I'm abundantly able to take care of myself and have been doing so for the last 10 years. Where is my son, Robert? I will have him show you to the door. Robert is the one who has sworn out the warrant against me? That afternoon, I was to learn that Robert had spent the last several weeks building up his case against me. He then gave me 1 hour's notice, appointed my defense attorney, Isaac Arnold, who offered no defense, and arranged for an army of witnesses to give testimony against me. My physician, Dr. Danforth, was called on to testify that I had complained of headaches which felt as if wires were being pulled through my eyes. Several other doctors who had never even examined me testified that based on what Robert had told them about me, they felt that yes, I did indeed belong in an asylum. Hotel clerks were called upon to tell of my irrational fear of fires and being alone. Store clerks to tell of my reckless and expensive purchases, such as clothing and jewelry that I could not wear, or curtains for windows when I had no permanent residence. Finally, Robert T. Lincoln himself rose on the witness stand to tell the court and the entire world that he thought his mother was insane. My attorney, Mr. Arnold, did not cross-examine, did not call a single witness. It took that jury of 12 upstanding Chicago citizens just 10 minutes to reach their verdict. Can you guess what it was? We, the undersigned, in the matter of Mary Lincoln are satisfied that said Mary Lincoln is insane and a fit person to be placed in a state hospital for the insane. I was to turn over my bonds to Robert T. Lincoln, who had gotten himself appointed conservator of my estate, and the next day I was to be taken to Bellevue Place, where I was to be confined for an undetermined period of time. That evening I tried to kill myself by drinking laudanum and camphor, but the druggist from whom I attempted to purchase these poisons guessed my purposes and sold me sugar water instead. So I was thwarted in my attempt. The next day I was taken to Batavia, Illinois, to Bellevue Place, and introduced to the superintendent there, Dr. Richard J. Patterson. Oh, the building itself resembled a country estate. 4-story limestone mansions surrounded by acres of shade trees and gardens. I learned that there were some 25 or 30 female patients there, and that except in the most extreme cases, Dr. Patterson preferred a treatment of rest, baths, diversion, the least amount of medication and restraint necessary. I should be allowed to take carriage rides, even have my meals with the doctor and his family if I liked. I'm sure Robert felt he was giving me a pleasant little vacation, but to me it was still a prison, and I immediately began to make plans to get out. Once again, good and loyal friends came to my assistance. General Farnsworth, Judge Bradwell and his wife Myra, my sister Elizabeth. Oh, the Bradwells in particular launched a most effective campaign in the newspapers designed to shame Robert and Dr. Patterson into releasing me. You see, anyone who came to visit me could tell that I was not insane, but had in fact been wrongfully imprisoned. Robert and Dr. Patterson were the only ones who maintained that I needed to be locked up, and of course they both had financial reasons to say that. Dr. Patterson, of course, did not want to lose a paying patient, and Robert, well, Robert couldn't wait until I died to get his hands on my money. He was afraid I might spend it all on myself and there'd be nothing left for him. Well, what business is it of his what I spend my money on? I don't criticize him for squandering money on bad real estate investments. Why should he lock me up for buying curtains? He was in control of my money now, and I was determined not only to be released, but to regain control of my estate. And you may be well assured that Robert T. Lincoln will receive nothing further from me. In September of 1875, a compromise was reached. I was released on a sort of probationary arrangement and went to live with Elizabeth in Springfield until another trial could be held, the earliest possibility of that being 12 months from the date of the original trial. Robert paid for my room and board with money from my estate, which he sent to Elizabeth and Ninian. I behaved myself tolerably well, spending only $5,000 on my only available pleasure in this miserable existence. But I was still obsessed, for although released from the sanitarium, I knew that I was still not free until I controlled my own money. Finally, on June 15, 1876, a second trial was held in Chicago. My brother-in-law Ninian presented a petition on my behalf, requesting that I be declared a fit and proper person to have care and management of her own estate. Robert and his evil cohorts offered no resistance, and I felt confident of victory. But even I was surprised by the verdict. Mary Lincoln is restored to reason. I was surprised because we had not requested such a judgment. How could I be restored to something I had never lost? Nevertheless, I was greatly pleased by this vindication, and I immediately notified Robert to return to me everything which I had ever given to him. To Robert T. Lincoln, June 19, 1876. Do not fail to send me without the least delay all my paintings, my silver set, laces, diamonds, and jewelry. Also, other articles which your wife appropriated and which are well known to you must be sent without a day's delay. 2 lawyers and myself have just been together. Their list coincides with my own and will be published soon. I am now in constant receipt of letters from my friends, denouncing you in the bitterest terms. I have 6 letters from prominent, respectable Chicago people, such as you do not associate with. 2 prominent clergymen have also written to me and mentioned in their letters that they think it advisable to offer up prayers for you in church on account of your wickedness against me and high heaven. Send me all that I have written for. You have tried your game of robbery long enough. Signed, Mrs. A. Lincoln. There was one other compromise which I agreed to make. I agreed to leave my bonds in the care of another conservator, anyone except Robert. A Springfield banker by the name of Jacob Bunn was selected as an acceptable alternative, and once the bonds were deposited with him, I again made plans to leave the country. As I told Elizabeth, I cannot bear to meet my former friends. They will never cease to regard me as a lunatic now. I feel I will be much less unhappy in the company of strangers. I also intended to put as much distance as possible between myself and my son, Robert. As my bitterness towards him knew no limits, I also feared he could not be trusted to leave me in peace. After all, he had already locked me up once before. Who could say he wouldn't try it again? Therefore, I swore Elizabeth to secrecy regarding my destination and my date of departure. I was accompanied as far as New York by Louis Baker, Elizabeth's grandson. He reminded me so much of dear Taddy, it nearly broke my heart. It was his loving face that I last looked upon as I boarded the steamship bound for France. I settled in Pau, a small village near the Pyrenees Mountains on the border between France and Spain. I lived there quietly for 4 years under an assumed name, relying upon Mr. Bunn to forward interest and pension payments to me, and corresponding with Louis. My dearest Louis, it is early evening, and the sun is slowly disappearing behind the mountain that rises above our village. How often I have wished that you were here with me, for I am certain that one glance at your beautiful face, filled with sweet sympathy, would gladden the heart of a lonely exile so very far from home. 4 long years, dear Louis, 4 long years, since we held one another in a last embrace, and I watched as you grew smaller and smaller standing on the pier. But even as you became a tiny speck and vanished, I knew that you were waiting still. As I have told you, I am not bitter toward your dear mother, a dreary old woman, sick in her mind, weary in her heart, would hardly have been a suitable traveling companion for a bright and fun-loving boy. And yet, if you were with me, if those I have loved in the past were still with me, should I not still be young and happy? It is not the years that age us, dear Louis, it is loneliness. And I must try to remember that you are no longer a boy, but a young man of 21, soon to be a graduate of Harvard, and go out into the world with that girl you wrote me of. But please, I beg of you, keep a small corner of your heart for an old lady who occupies a hall bedroom in a tiny hotel in the smallest village in the Pyrenees. She is known to the villagers as Madame Gardner, an unhappy American lady in mourning for her husband and her children. But not unkind, not a cold woman, a woman who sits alone in the square and smiles at the children as they play. It is very sad, say the villagers, for the poor old soul with no family so far from home. They don't understand. They don't know that I am cradled here in these mountains, shielded from time and its terrors, so that I am nowhere. Don't laugh at me, dear Louis, but when I hear the cowbells echoing in the mountains, I rush to the window of a house, the corner of 8th and Jackson in Springfield, Illinois. And the bells get louder and louder, and I look down the street to where a crowd is coming, cheering and throwing their hats in the air. And in the middle of the crowd, taller than anyone, walks Mr. Lincoln. That expression I know so well on his face, sad, tired, but a slight smile. Everyone trying to shake his hand, his face lit by torchlight. And my heart is beating so fast, I have to hold on to the windowsill. I rush down the stairs to meet him at the door, and I can't keep the tears from my face. People pour in all around. I don't hear what they're saying. It is only when he comes in and stands above me, and I feel his hand on my shoulder, and he says to me, "Well, Mother, I am to be president." Then I understand what has happened. "I'm very glad, Mr. Lincoln," I say, "but I'd better go and put on a pot of coffee for our guests." And presently, it fades away. And I'm in a foreign land, and my loved ones have disappeared into the years. And I sit in my little room, existing, merely existing, until the next memory comes to transport me back again. It is not better than death, dear Louis. Nothing could be better for me than death now. But it is better than life. It will do while I wait. But oh, the waiting is so long. I stayed away as long as I could. But my health has deteriorated so badly now that I've been forced at last to return to the United States. The doctors say I'm suffering from chronic inflammation of the spinal cord, chronic diseases of the kidney, commencing cataract, reflex paralysis of the iris. I can only tell you that I am without the least eyesight, indeed feeble in my spine and limbs, and in almost constant pain. And so, I have come back to Elizabeth's house once more. Dear Elizabeth, she still cares for me so patiently, although I know I am sometimes very unkind to her. I sit here in my room, my eyes so blinded by weeping that they cannot tolerate much light. At night, when I sleep, I'm careful to lie on only one side of the bed, so as not to disturb the president's place beside me. And I spend hours going through my trunks. Only friends I have left in the world. Memories of happier times. Things I bought to comfort myself in times of sorrow. Isn't it beautiful? For 17 years I have prayed to be removed from this world in which I've been called upon to suffer so much. Time does not soften it, nor can I ever be reconciled to my loss until the grave closes over the remembrance and I am reunited with my loved and lost. And so, I must wait.
Mary.
Mr. Lincoln, you've come for me at last.
Miss Todd, I would like to dance with you in just about the worst way. Mary Lincoln died on July the 16th, 1882, at the age of 63. She left behind 64 trunks filled with clothing and jewelry that she was never going to use. She, like her husband, died without a will, and she left her entire estate to her only son, Robert Todd Lincoln, an estate valued at over $84,000. Surely there were those who mourned for Mary Lincoln, but for her a wish had been granted. At last there would be no parting, no more anguish to be endured, and no more tears to shed. She would at last be reunited with her angel boys and her beloved Mr. Lincoln.
Thank you. I don't know if you have a more meeting or is there anything else that you need to do. It's sort of our tradition after performances to answer questions, if we can answer anything for you, unless you really would rather get to the coffee and cookies. Any questions we can answer? Yes, ma'am.
Where was the house in Chicago located?
The house in Chicago was on Washington Street. I don't remember the exact address off the top of my head. It was West Washington Street. Trying to think of the North-South Street. I think it was like somewhere in the area like Franklin and Washington. As I understand, I believe that house either burned up in the fire or it was demolished later on for some new construction.
Did Lincoln have to testify in front of Stanton and that you were like a sympathizer for the Confederacy?
You want to handle that one?
I certainly will. I never testified before the Committee on the Conduct of the War. I don't know where that rumor started. I would have been willing to testify to that fact, but obviously the Committee on the Conduct of the War never called me. If I had ever heard about something like that, I guarantee you I would have went over there and I would have done more than testify. I think Mrs. Lincoln was unjustly and unfairly treated by the press. So if I had heard anything of that nature, I would have. They wouldn't have had to ask me. I would have invited myself.
Well, do you feel that there was a conspiracy against you as far as your death?
Conspiracy by you mean
Yeah,
by a group of people?
With the cabinet.
Oh, with the cabinet, no.
Okay.
Secretary Stanton and I, probably if you took two people in the world and tried to match them, we would not match in for a close.
Right.
Personality-wise, he was very abrasive, he was sometimes very arrogant, but he was the best Secretary of War that any man could have ever asked for as the President. So my cabinet, although not one big happy family, did what I thought was necessary, and they helped win the war. But no, I don't think it was anything to do with the Confederate Army or the Confederate military or the Confederate government. I don't think it was anything to do with my cabinet. I do think that a very small band of people who with some misguided motives were the culprits, but I don't think it was either my government or the Confederate government had anything to do with it.
Actually, the original hit list was not only the president, but also the vice president and the secretary of state. So it doesn't really make much sense that they would have been in on a conspiracy to assassinate Lincoln and put themselves on the list. The conspirators, John Wilkes Booth and his gang, if you want to call it that, one was assigned to assassinate Vice President Johnson. One was assigned to assassinate Secretary Seward. The man who was assigned to kill Vice President Johnson sort of chickened out, I guess, if you want to.
He got drunk and went home.
Did not even make the attempt. But the man who was assigned to kill Secretary Seward almost did. The secretary had been in a carriage accident a few days before and was confined to bed at home with a neck brace, protecting his neck and jaw. And the assassin got inside the house and attacked him in his bed and cut him very severely. The only thing that saved his life was the neck brace he was wearing, because the knife glanced off that, otherwise he would have cut the jugular vein. So the only one who actually succeeded in his assignment that night was John Wilkes Booth.
Does anybody remember what happened to Secretary Seward later on in life? He made one of the dumbest purchases. Yeah, he bought Alaska, and at the time people thought that is the dumbest thing anybody's ever done. Well, thank God for dumbness. But him and Thomas Jefferson buying Louisiana, I think those were the two dumbest, best purchases we ever had. Now this young lady.
I was wondering if the people that plotted the death of Lincoln and some of the other individuals had any connection or sympathy with the Confederate Army.
And I was just pointing out, I can't find any. There's a couple of bit of a very good book called, not Reconstruction, Retribution. Come Retribution, where they tried to tie parts of it together, but I just can't find a very good connection. There are some floating things around that may or may not have connections, but I just don't think that the Confederate government, given the mentality and the chivalriness of the, especially of the military, of the civilians, Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens, I don't think they would have ever consented to anything as barbaric as killing, the President of the United States. I just can't, there have been all sorts of theories and speculation, but I've read only about 4 or 5 books, but I can't find anything that makes me very comfortable with saying, yes, it was a Confederate government. As the question about Stanton, there was some speculation Stanton was involved, but again, I can't find good threads. You can find wisps of smoke floating around, but that's not a smoking gun as far as I'm concerned. This young man first. Well, both of you young men.
Younger.
Oh, okay, the younger guy.
Well, you're both young compared to us.
Good looking guy.
Just ask you the general question, what would happen if they were successful of knocking off all those?
We don't know. Unfortunately,
Alexander Haig, I think, is going to take over.
that would have been a very good question.
Yes, the motive being to kill off the top echelon of the federal government, to create enough confusion in the government that the South has a chance to rally and continue to fight. So whoever would serve next after the Secretary of State, I guess.
Yeah.
Constitutionally, I know that there's a role or line of succession.
Yeah, the Speaker of the House, which would be Leonard Haskell, right? We could have had somebody else from Illinois. Yes, sir.
With Mrs. Grant, is the reason why they didn't attend Ford Theater with Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln is because of the issues that they had as far as Mary Todd being jealous of Grant being more popular than Lincoln at the time because of when the Civil War veteran.
I'll be
Is that
over
the
here.
reason more so than
Well,
going to visit her son?
Yeah, the official reason was that they wanted to visit their children, but yeah, Mrs. Grant and Mrs. Lincoln did not get along, definitely. And the two gentlemen had agreed earlier in the day at the cabinet meeting. Mr. Lincoln said, would you come join us? And the general said he would. Then they went home and they each told their wives. And the women said, no.
In fact, I don't know what that just jogged, but I hate to repeat things I find on the internet because there's so much out there that's not. But apparently there was also a plot to kill General Grant. Apparently he got some information or letters a few days later saying, "Thank God, what I was supposed to do I didn't do. That you're safe and that So, but I haven't found the source of it yet. So I get very skeptical when I can't find the source. But it certainly adds to the conspiracy. They were going to kill off everybody they could.
And one more question. Mary Owens and Ann Rutledge?
Next question.
You're, sorry.
Gee, look at the time. I'll answer it. Yes, I loved Ann Rutledge as a friend, not romantically. Ann Rutledge was engaged at the time I knew her.
To someone else.
To someone else. Yes, I was engaged to Mary Owens, but she broke off the engagement because I was deficient in those little links that make up a woman's happiness, whatever that means. And at that point, I was crushed because although I had basically talked her out of getting married, when she spurned me, I got very upset, as I did. And I was sort of like Groucho Marx. I vowed I would never ever marry a woman who would marry me. So it's, but no, I was very deeply saddened by Ann Rutledge's death. She was almost like a sister to me because, as you know, I lost my sister when I was 18, and I had lost my mother. So it seemed at that point every woman that I become attached to, I lost, and so I was very upset, but not in a romantic way. But no.
Besides, Mr. Lincoln has frequently told me that I'm the only woman he ever loved, and you all know how honest he is.
As a lawyer, I will point out the operative word there is woman. Ann Rutledge was a young girl, so technically whatever is what it was. Any other questions? Oh, this young man.
What was the president's salary?
$25,000. Matter of fact, the only bit of trivia, the only president who didn't take a salary was Washington. George Washington agreed to be the president if they would pay his expenses, and that was the catch. He had so many expenses, they decided, okay, rather than just pay the expenses, we will give him a salary. And so after Washington, everybody got a
We'll
salary.
pay you a salary and you pay your
You
own.
pay your own expenses, and that's the reason most presidents left office much poorer than when they went in.
And that's one of the reasons that Mary's expenditures in the White House were so scandalous at the time. Nowadays, you pretty much take it for granted that the government picks up the tab for the president and his family, but at the time, Mary was the first one to say, no, wait a minute, this is the government's responsibility to pay for, not ours personally. And the reaction at the time was, what do you mean she wants the government to pay for this? Who does she think she is? And that's why it was so scandalous at the time, is that now it doesn't seem that big a deal because we take it for granted, but at the time, it made a lot of waves, I guess you want to call it.
Yes,
Did Mary take any of the china home with her?
I was accused in the newspapers of looting the White House when I left. I plead not guilty to those charges. I was unable to get out of my bed for 6 weeks. I was so overwrought. Meanwhile, for those 6 weeks, downstairs, the White House was wide open. The American public could come into the White House almost at will during that time. And the place was literally flooded with American souvenir seekers coming into the house and carrying off anything that almost wasn't nailed down as their souvenir of the martyred president. And things from the White House began showing up in resale shops in Washington not too long after the assassination, and it wasn't me who took them there. I've been accused of, like I say, looting the White House when I actually think it was the American public who did that. I did take some personal things that we had brought with us in the first place, but almost everything that I bought for the redecoration was still there when I left, so after that I can't.
well, the White House china is still there, so she didn't take that, but we do know the china is still there. But and my bedroom, that if any of you ever go there and pay that exorbitant price to sleep in, was not my bedroom. That was my office. A great story about one of our great leaders from the state of Illinois, Adlai Stevenson, who was a great Lincoln fan and really admired Lincoln, and was invited to spend the night in the Lincoln bedroom, and he was overwrought by the fact that he was going to sleep in the same bed that Mr. Lincoln did. And so he took a pillow and a blanket and laid on the sofa, only to find out the next morning that Mr. Lincoln never slept in that bed. But he often slept on the sofa, so as much as he tried, he couldn't get away from it.
Tried to avoid doing, we wound up doing after all.
Any other questions? Okay, then I get that some. We'll then with the history question. How many remember what number president I was?
16.
Okay. Who was the 15th president?
Guy before you.
Okay, I realize I have to be an attorney here. How many of you remember the name of the 15th president?
James Buchanan.
James Buchanan. Who's the only president we've ever had that wasn't married?
Buchanan.
James Buchanan. What's the most popular name first name for a president? James, okay. Put your thinking caps on and name me 3 of the 5 American presidents, 6 presidents, who are not buried in what we call the continental United States. And one of them is named James, but it isn't Buchanan. Ready? Presidents Bush, Clinton, Bush, Ford, and James Carter. Thank you. Thank you.
I keep telling him someone's going to shoot him someday.
As long as I stay out of Washington, I'm all right. Just thinking about the theater gives me a headache.
Well, we certainly thank you for coming today. Your program was very enlightening and enjoyable. And thank Joe Stackman for videotaping and for Lincoln telling us that we could, giving us the authority to do that, permission. I also want to thank Joanne for the refreshments today. She always does an excellent job. And thank our husbands who came and set up today.
Yes,
and
thank you, gentlemen.
And
they help bring in the
things
things.
down.
Yeah, and Joanne and I certainly could not be involved with so many different organizations and doing things if it wasn't for our husbands, and I apologize for the frickin' frack. We always tease because we have another friend who's the secretary, corresponding secretary, Modesta Gonzalez. And when Modesta and Joe and I go to all of our Legion things, we always say the three men are the three amigos. Sometimes students, yeah, were upset with them, but no, really, we couldn't do the things we do if it wasn't for their understanding and their help. So thank you for coming today, and please enjoy our refreshments. And we hope to see you all again.